Chapter 2. The value of money as a substance. The intrinsic value of money and the measurement of value. Through all the discussions of the nature of money there runs the question as to whether money, in order to carry out its services of measurement, exchange and representation of values, is or ought to be a value itself, or whether it is enough if money is simply a token and symbol without intrinsic value, like an accounting sum which stands for a value without being one. The whole technical and historical discussion of this question, which involves the most profound issues in the theory of money and value, would be superfluous if it could be decided by a frequently quoted logical argument. A measuring instrument, it is said, has to have the same quality as the object to be measured. A measure of length has to be long, a measure of weight has to be heavy, a measure of space has to have dimensions. Consequently, a measure of value has to be valuable. No matter how unrelated two things may be in all other respects, when I measure them against each other, they must both have the quality that I am comparing. Any quantitative and numerical equality or inequality that I assert would be meaningless if it did not refer to relative quantities of one and the same quality. Indeed, this identity of qualities must not be of too general a nature. For instance, it is impossible to compare the beauty of a piece of architecture with the beauty of a person, even though both have the quality of beauty. Only the particular architectural or the particular human qualities of beauty make a comparison possible. But even if a common quality is lacking, one might still consider the reaction of the contemplating subject as a basis for comparability. If the beauty of a building and the beauty of a person are comparable in the amount of enjoyment that the contemplation of either one of them affords us, then an identity of qualities might be asserted in spite of the apparent variation. The equal effect upon the same subject reflects the equality of the objects with reference to the relation in question. Two completely different phenomena that give the same pleasure to the same subject have, over and above all their differences, an equal force or an equal relation to the subject, just as when a gust of wind and a human hand break a branch of a tree demonstrate, in spite of the incomparability of their qualities, an equal amount of energy. Thus the substance of money, and everything that is measured by it, may be completely different, but they would have to coincide in the one point that they both have value, and even if value is nothing but a subjective response to the impressions received from things, at least the quality by which they affect the sense of value in men has to be the same in both, even though it cannot be isolated. Thus, it is claimed that money has to have the quality of value because it is compared with values and enters into a quantitative equation with values. I will contrast this line of argument with another which produces different results. It is true that, in the example given, we can compare the force of the wind that breaks the branch of a tree with that of the human hand doing the same thing, only so far as this force exists as a quantity in both. But we can measure the force of the wind also by the thickness of the branch that it has broken. I admit that the broken branch does not yet express the amount of energy of the wind in the same sense as the energy of the hand may express it, but the comparative force of two gusts of wind, and thus the relative force of each, can be measured by the fact that one has broken a branch which the other was unable to harm. The following example seems to me to be conclusive. The most heterogeneous objects we know, the two poles of the worldview which neither metaphysics nor science has succeeded in reducing to each other, are the motions of matter and the states of consciousness. The pure extension of the one and the pure internality of the other have not so far allowed any point to be discovered that could plausibly be regarded as their meeting ground. Nevertheless, the physiological psychologist can measure the relative changes in the strength of conscious sensations by the changes in the external motions that affect our sense organs. Since there is a constant quantitative relation between the two factors, the size of one determines the relative size of the other, without any qualitative relationship or identity having to exist between them. The logical principle that appeared to make the ability of money to measure value dependent upon its own value is thus breached. It is indeed correct that the quantities of different objects can be compared only if they are of the same quality. Wherever measurement is done by direct comparison of two quantities, it presupposes identical qualities. But wherever a change, a difference, or the relation between two quantities is to be measured, it is sufficient for their determination that the proportions of the measuring objects are reflected by the proportions of those measured, and there need be no qualitative identity of the objects. Two objects with different qualities cannot be equalized, but two proportions between qualitatively different things may be. The two objects M and N may have some relationship that has nothing to do with qualitative identity, so that neither one can serve directly as a measure for the other. The relation may be one of cause and effect, of symbolism, of common relationship to a third factor, or anything else. Let us assume as given that an object A is known to be a quarter of M, and an object B is known to be some quantitative part of N. If a relation exists between A and B, corresponding to the relation M and N, it follows that B equals a quarter of N. In spite of a qualitative difference and the impossibility of any direct comparison between A and B, it is nevertheless possible to determine the quantity of one by the quantity of the other. For instance, there is no relation of identity between a certain quantity of food and the acute need for food that might be satisfied by it, but if so much food is available that half of the need is filled, I can accordingly determine that the available quantity of food equals half of the need. Under these circumstances, it is sufficient that an overall relationship exists in order to measure the quantities of its parts. If one can now interpret the measurement of objects by money in this fashion, then the idea of their direct comparability, and consequently the logical requirement that money itself should possess value, becomes untenable. In order to proceed from this logical possibility to reality, we need only assume a very general relationship between the quantity of goods and the quantity of money, which is illustrated by the connection, often obscured or disrupted, between an increasing supply of money and rising prices, an increasing supply of goods and falling prices. Thus we can form, with qualifications as to their exact scope, the concepts of a total supply of commodities, a total supply of money, and a relationship of mutual dependence between them. Every single commodity is now a definite part of the available sum of commodities. If we call the latter A, the commodity is I/MA. Its price is the corresponding part of the total quantity of money. If we call the latter B, then the price equals I/MB. If we knew the quantity of A and B, and the proportion of all saleable goods which a specific object represents, then we should also know its price in terms of money, and vice versa. A definite amount of money can thus determine or measure the value of an object, regardless of whether money and the valuable object possess any identical quality, and so regardless of whether money itself is valuable. Problems of measurement. It is always necessary to keep in mind the complete relativity of measurement. Absolute quantities that are equivalent measure each other in a quite different sense from the partial quantities which are in question here. If it is assumed, with certain qualifications, that the total amount of money equals the value of the total amount of commodities for sale, then this equation need not be taken as a measure of one quantity by the other. They are set in a relation of equivalence only through the relationship that both have to the valuing person and his practical purposes.